The scent of ash and frozen pine was the only thing keeping Cora Sterling grounded as another wave of visceral agony ripped through her spine. The forgotten dungeon vaults of Ashfell Keep offered neither warmth nor mercy. The floor was a bed of cracked, freezing masonry that leached the heat directly from her bones. She lay on her side in the darkest corner of the ruined cellar, her knees drawn tightly toward her chest, measuring the excruciating intervals between her contractions by the steady echo of water dripping from a rusted ceiling pipe. Drop. Silence. Drop. The rhythm was a cruel metronome dictating the pace of her silent suffering. She needed something soft, something clean. Her trembling fingers worked frantically against the rough fabric of her garments. The heavy winter gown she wore was useless, stiff with dried mud and the sweat of a 3-day flight from the borderlands where Caelan Vance's enforcers hunted anything that breathed defiance. Beneath the heavy wool, her underlayer was the only viable option. With a sharp pull, she ripped the fabric, preparing the torn shift linen to serve as the first defense between her coming child and the unforgiving stone. The sound of tearing fabric seemed deafening in the cavernous silence of the vault, making her strain her ears toward the heavy iron door above. But there was only the wind howling through the upper courtyards. Another contraction seized her, locking her muscles into a rigid cage of blinding pain. Cora reached blindly into the dark, her fingers finding a discarded strip of harness leather she had scavenged from a crumbling stable. She clamped her teeth down hard on the tough hide, the bitter taste of cured animal skin masking the copper tang of her own blood. She swallowed the scream that clawed at her throat, forcing it down into her chest until it became nothing more than a ragged exhalation through her nose. The gravel bit into her palms like broken teeth as she braced her hands against the floor, grounding herself against the physical reality of the stone instead of the panic threatening to consume her mind. There was no royal healer here, no soft linens infused with lavender and comfrey, no warm water to guide her through the terror, just the crushing weight of isolation and the relentless mechanics of a body pushed to its absolute limit. The cold air burned in her lungs, but she did not allow herself the luxury of losing focus. Panic was a lapse in strategy she could not afford. She calculated the remaining time, tracking the increasing intensity of the pain, knowing the child would not wait for safety. Her only focus was the small pile of tattered fabric beside her, the meager sanctuary she had built with her bruised hands, determined to offer her pup a fraction of the warmth the world had denied them. The final stage of labor demanded a surrender she was terrified to give, but her body obeyed an ancient biological imperative that bypassed conscious fear. When the child finally slipped into the freezing world, there was no triumphant cry, no sudden burst of magical warmth. There was only the wet, heavy slide of life arriving in the dark, accompanied by the raw scent of fresh blood and the sharp intake of the newborn's first breath. Cora caught the tiny, fragile weight of her pup with shaking hands, bringing him instantly to her chest to share whatever residual heat remained in her exhausted core. Her breath hitched, her lungs expanding in a silent gasp of sheer relief and immediate responsibility. The silence in the cellar was absolute. Not a single sound escaped her lips as she moved with mechanical precision, her survival instincts overriding physical collapse. She cleared the infant's airway with the edge of her thumb, her touch impossibly gentle against his wet skin. The pup let out a faint whimper, a sound so small it was almost entirely swallowed by the vast emptiness of the vault. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly reached for the damp, makeshift swaddle she had prepared. She bundled the newborn tightly, layering the thin fabric around his shivering form, tucking the edges securely to trap the warmth of her own skin against his. She named him Wren, a silent vow sworn in the dark. Exhaustion settled deep into the marrow of her bones, a crushing weight that made holding her arms up feel like a monumental task. She leaned her back against the freezing, crumbling wall of the cellar, bringing the wrapped bundle up to her chin. The scent of warm milk, copper blood, and raw life filled the narrow space between them, creating a fragile pocket of existence. A single hot tear broke past the rigid control Cora had maintained for so long, tracing a burning path down her cheek before dropping onto the damp fabric covering Wren's forehead. She did not break down into hysterical weeping. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. And even now, emotional restraint was an armor she could not take off. Her hands, cracked and bleeding, cradled the tiny pup with a fierce, quiet desperation. Survival was merely the grueling act of holding on until the next drop of water fell. The temperature in the lower vaults of Ashfell Keep did not drop so much as it settled. A heavy, motionless cold that sank into the marrow of the bone. Kneeling in the darkest corner of the cell, Cora's breath plumed in faint, rhythmic clouds as she held the tiny bundle against her chest. The torn shift linen offered only the thinnest barrier against the freezing ambient air. Slowly, carefully, she peeled back the edge of the damp fabric to inspect her newborn under a jagged splinter of northern moonlight. As the pale lunar light struck the child's crown, a strange, unnatural sheen reflected back at her. It was not the dull, coarse brown of the Border Pack's infants. It was bright, luminous. She reached out with a trembling, blood-stained thumb and rubbed firmly at the crown of his head. Her first instinct, logical and deeply ingrained, was that it was simply a trick of the moonlight hitting moisture. She wiped at the fur again, harder this time, expecting the metallic gleam to smear away onto her skin. It did not smear, it did not wipe away. Underneath the rough pad of her finger, the fur was shockingly soft, forming a showering silver pelt. Her lungs simply stopped working. The air in the cell felt as though it had turned to solid ice, lodging itself between her ribs like a sliver of cold glass. The metallic fur was not merely a rare mutation. In the deep northern territories, beneath the crushing jurisdiction of the sovereign laws, it was a death sentence if discovered by the wrong authority. Her old pack, under the ruthless command of Caelan Vance, had spent a decade hunting down and executing any pup born with non-standard traits. They called it culling the weak. Cora knew it was something else entirely. The eradication of the ancient royal bloodline to prevent any challenge to their inherited ranks. She stared at the tiny, whimpering creature in her arms, the sheen of his coat catching the moonlight like freshly minted coinage. This was the mark of the old kings. The realization did not bring the swelling pride of a mother holding a miracle. It brought an absolute suffocating weight. Her vision narrowed to the pounding of a single, frantic heartbeat. If the border trackers found her now, they would not just kill her for fleeing. They would butcher her son, Wren Sterling, in front of her. She rubbed at the silver tufts one last, desperate time, as if sheer willpower could stain him a safe, invisible brown. The fur only gleamed brighter, a beacon in the dark that she could not extinguish. Before the realization could fully solidify into a sound, she would never allow herself to voice. The very foundation of the keep began to vibrate. It started as a low, structural hum traveling through the granite flagstones, vibrating against her bare knees. Then came the noise, the heavy, unmistakable groan of rusted iron hinges echoing down the cavernous corridor of the dungeon vaults. Cora's head snapped up. The nightly security patrol had begun. Usually, the guards did not bother inspecting the deepest abandoned sections of Ashfell Keep. They stayed near the wine cellars and the upper armories, places where the braziers still held dying embers. But tonight, the rhythmic, heavy tread of iron-capped boots was moving downward. The sound was deliberate, unhurried, and tracking precisely in the direction of her cell. She had to move. The thought was clear, tactical, and immediate, overriding the overwhelming exhaustion that threatened to pull her down into unconsciousness. She clutched the newborn tighter to her chest, folding the torn shift linen over his head to completely obscure the dangerous gleam of his pelt. Cora pressed her palms flat against the freezing, frost-slicked wall of the cell and attempted to stand. Her legs, hollowed out by hours of excruciating, silent labor, immediately buckled. A sharp, tearing agony radiated through her lower spine, forcing a silent gasp through her clenched teeth. She did not fall. She refused to fall. Jagged shards of stone gouged into her flesh as she dragged herself upward, using the uneven masonry of the wall as a crutch. Her knuckles turned stark white against the dark stone, the tendons in her wrists standing out like taut wire. She forced her knees to lock, securing the joint with sheer, desperate physical discipline. Every muscle in her core trembled violently, fighting against the biological demand to collapse, to rest, to bleed. The echoing footsteps grew louder. 2 sets, perhaps 3, though the acoustics of the curved stone ceiling made it difficult to count accurately. She needed to find the darkest geometry of the room, a shadow deep enough to swallow them both. The cell was agonizingly barren, just rotting straw, crumbling mortar, and the biting wind that sneaked through the iron grate. She regulated her breathing, forcing her shallow, frantic breaths into slow, measured exhalations through her nose. If they heard her, they would find her. If they smelled the fresh copper tang of her blood over the ubiquitous scent of mold and freezing pine, they would find her. She stood perfectly still for 3 agonizing seconds, mapping the layout of the cell in the pitch blackness, calculating the exact angle of the moonlight, and where the shadows fell thickest. The heavy iron door at the end of the corridors slammed open with a concussive boom that rattled the mortar from the ceiling. A flickering, unnatural yellow light began to spill across the corridor floor outside her cestal. The patrol was not just passing by. They were checking the doors. Cora tightened her grip on her son, ignoring the searing pain in her own body, and took her first agonizing step away from the sliver of light. Cora Sterling moved. It was not a conscious decision, but the primal, unthinking reflex of an animal cornered in the dark. Her legs, still trembling and slick with the aftermath of labor, threatened to give way under the sheer weight of her exhaustion. She dragged herself backward over the freezing flagstones, ignoring the sharp scrape of debris against her bare knees. The dungeon air was thick with the scent of damp earth, mildew, and her own metallic blood. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, aching with a hollow, tearing sensation that she forced herself to swallow down. In the darkest corner of the cell stood a towering, rotting wooden crate, left behind from some forgotten era of the keep's history. Between its splintered back and the crumbling masonry of the outer wall was a gap barely wide enough for a half-starved servant, let alone a woman clutching a newborn. Cora did not care about the geometry of the space. She turned sideways, compressing her shoulders, and wedged her body into the suffocating crevice. Rough stone bit through the thin fabric of her dress, scraping a long line of heat down her spine. The rotting wood of the crate pressed flush against her collarbone, boxing her into a vertical coffin of shadow. The damp, torn shift linen served as the only barrier between his fragile body and the suffocating dirt of their hiding place. He was impossibly small. The fragile knot of life radiated a staggering amount of heat against her freezing skin. When the newborn shifted, letting out a soft, reedy intake of breath that signaled an impending whimper, the young mother reacted instantly. She pressed the pad of her thumb gently but firmly past his lips. The pup suckled instinctively, his small gums clamping down on her skin, and the noise ceased before it could truly begin. Cora closed her eyes, letting her head rest back against the freezing masonry. The air in the narrow gap was stifling. It hung heavy with centuries of undisturbed dust that swirled upward with every rapid exhale she made. A thick layer of cobwebs brushed against her cheek, leaving a sticky, crawling sensation across her skin. The dust tickled the back of her throat, threatening to force a cough from her burning lungs. She swallowed hard, clamping her jaw shut, and focused entirely on the rhythm of her own breathing. In, hold, out. The physical effort required to remain completely silent while her body demanded oxygen was absolute agony. The heavy rhythm of leather boots echoed down the corridor outside. The sound cut through the silence of the vaults, like the steady, methodical swing of an executioner's axe. 2 sets of footsteps, perhaps 3. They were moving deliberately, pausing at each iron door, checking the heavy locks. The walls of the crevice seemed to shrink inward, pressing the rotting wood tighter against her chest, squeezing the remaining air from her lungs. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead, mingling with the grime and dust sticking to her face. Her vision blurred. The oppressive darkness of the cell gave way to the vivid, waking nightmare she had carried across the border. It was not the cold dungeon she saw, but the sunlit courtyard of her former pack. The memory tasted of copper and ash. She could still hear the brutal, indifferent drawl of Caelan Vance, standing before the witness circle, declaring that weakness would be culled from the bloodline. She remembered the way the crowd had stood perfectly still, watching as a pup with the wrong fur color was ripped from a mother's arms. The ruthless leader had not even looked at the child. He had simply given a flick of his wrist, a casual administrative gesture that ended a life before it had truly begun. The phantom smell of ozone and spilled blood filled her nostrils, overriding the mildew of the cellar. A sharp, high-pitched ringing started in her ears. It was a physical overload, threatening to rip away the last of her control. Her breathing hitched, turning shallow and rapid, the dust in her throat catching dangerously. If she coughed, they would find her. If she made a single sound, they would find the pup. They would see the silver fur, and the cycle of slaughter would begin again in a new territory. She needed an anchor. She needed something real to drag her mind back to the freezing present. Shifting her weight slightly, the exhausted woman reached down, with her free hand pressing her palm flat against the jagged, uneven surface of the stone floor. She pushed down with all the meager strength she had left, grinding her flesh into the scattered debris. The coarse rubble sliced into her hands. Sharp, clean pain spiked up her wrist, slicing through the ringing in her head. She leaned harder into the stone, letting the physical sting sharpen her focus. It reminded her that she was here, in Ashfell Keep, and not bleeding out in a northern courtyard. The pain was a map, guiding her back to the reality of the freezing air, the heavy footsteps outside the door, and the tiny, silver-furred weight breathing softly against her chest. The subterranean corridor stretched deep beneath the main keep, a winding artery of damp limestone and rusted iron bars that most of the royal court preferred to forget. Alpha King Darius Vaughan did not believe in forgetting the foundations of his own home. He walked the abandoned vaults alone, the heavy wool of his cloak absorbing the damp chill. There were no royal guards flanking him, no courtiers whispering in his wake. The heavy, measured tread of his boots against the freezing flagstones was enough to command the dark. Ashfell Keep was ancient, built on top of deep natural fault lines that required constant, meticulous surveillance. In his right hand, the king carried a high-grade mage lantern, its polished glass cylinder casting sharp amber shadows across the curving architecture. The air down here was thick with the scent of frozen ozone and centuries of undisturbed dust. Darius observed his territory not with the frantic paranoia of a weak ruler, but with the quiet, structural calculation of a man who knew the exact load-bearing weight of every pillar. Near the intersection of the 5th sublevel, his sharp eyes caught a subtle irregularity. An old iron torch bracket hung loose from the stone. Any other sovereign would have ignored the minor flaw, or catalogued it for a servant to repair by dawn. Darius bent at the waist, setting the heavy brass base of his lantern onto the ground. He gripped the freezing iron, his knuckles pale, and with a single controlled application of force, drove the spike firmly back into the crumbling mortar. A small shower of grey dust drifted down over his leather boots. He brushed the debris from his fingers. Power was not a declaration shouted from a velvet-lined throne room. It was the quiet assumption of responsibility for the cold, broken spaces where no one else was looking. Darius picked up the lantern, the brass handle cold against his palm, and resumed his steady march deeper into the vaults. The ambient temperature dropped with every passing yard, his breath leaving his lungs in faint, pale plumes of frost. It was merely a routine security sweep of the abandoned sectors, checking for breached grates or the slow ingress of winter meltwater. He preferred this barren isolation to the endless, calculated noise of the upper court. Down here, the geometry of the world was honest. He stopped before the final row of containment cells. Repurposed long ago for excess winter storage, they had simply been abandoned to the damp, creeping chill of the northern winter. As Darius swept the lantern's beam across the heavy iron doors, his gaze snagged on a crucial inconsistency. The door of the third vault stood slightly ajar, the amber light caught on the exposed, rusted hinges. He did not draw his broadsword. He did not issue a sharp command into the darkness. Instead, the king reached out with a flat palm and pushed the heavy iron door inward. The hinges groaned in protest, a low scraping vibration that settled deep in his chest. As the door swung wide, illuminating a rotting wooden supply crate and a pile of collapsed masonry, the sensory shift was immediate and violently out of place. His canine senses flared, cataloguing the sudden, overwhelming intrusion of biological heat. The raw, metallic tang of fresh copper blood hit him first, thick and unmistakable. Beneath it came the sweet, milky fragrance of a newborn pup, an odor so fragile it barely registered above the damp rot of the stone, and weaving through both was a third layer, sharp and acidic, paralyzing, suffocating fear. Darius stepped over the threshold, planting his boots on the flagstones, and stood completely still. He created a sudden vacuum of sound, a heavy, calculated stillness, the physical manifestation of an apex predator deliberately shutting down its own hunting instincts. He controlled his breathing, forcing the freezing air into his lungs, through his nose, in slow increments, to avoid escalating the terror he could smell bleeding from the shadows. The amber glow of the high-grade mage lantern swept across the frost-slicked walls, cutting through the cavernous gloom until it settled squarely on the rotting wooden supply crate, pushed into the corner. Behind that splintering wood, Cora's meticulously constructed survival instincts disintegrated. The frantic calculations that had kept her alive through months of border exile abandoned her. The brutal stone ground into her skin as she shifted her weight, trying to find a better angle to shield the baby. In Kaelin's territory, the discovery of a non-standard trait was met with swift, brutal execution. Cora curled her spine outward, burying her face into the damp, swaddling cloth that wrapped her son, physically offering her own bruised back to take the brunt of the executioner's blow. The crate shifted slightly as a large, gloved hand rested on its upper edge. The raw terror locked behind her teeth finally tore free. "Please don't be mad," she sobbed, hiding the silver pup beneath her forearms. Her voice was a cracked, desperate whisper, ruined by hours of unassisted labor. The words scraped against her throat like broken glass. She squeezed her eyes shut, her face contorting in agonizing anticipation of the strike. She hunched her shoulders, every nerve ending screaming as she braced for the impact of a heavy fist or the cold bite of iron. No blow fell. The freezing dungeon air remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. Darius Vaughan remained absolutely motionless. His broad-shouldered frame stood frozen just inches from the edge of the crate. The cold, tactical readiness of an Alpha King, expecting an assassin, had vanished entirely. The mage lantern hanging from his left hand tilted slightly, casting a steady, golden beam directly onto the small, trembling woman huddled in the dirt. His pale, intense gaze was not locked onto the blood-stained fabric of her shift, but onto the tiny sliver of space between Cora's tightly clenched fingers. The torn linen had shifted just slightly as she braced for the blow. Beneath the protective cage of her hands, the dim light caught the edge of a tiny, perfect ear and a patch of newborn fur. It was not the dull grey or coarse brown of the common border packs. It was a brilliant, metallic hue that seemed to generate its own faint luminescence in the dark. The legendary glowing fur. Darius's breath hitched. It was a sharp, involuntary intake of air that broke his usual, measured rhythm, echoing faintly against the stone ceiling. The locked ledgers in the royal archives, the bloodline registries that had been considered myth for over 3 centuries. They were breathing in the cold air of his own dungeon. The profound, reverent awe settling over his features completely rewrote the hard geometry of his face. He did not speak. He did not demand an explanation. Moving with deliberate, agonizing slowness, the sovereign reached down to his tactical belt. His thick fingers closed over the heavy iron buckle, securing his weaponry. There was a sharp scrape of metal against hardened leather, followed by the heavy slide of a scabbard detaching from its housing. Darius did not hand the weapon off or lean it carefully against a wall. He simply let his massive broadsword fall. The weapon clattered violently against the uneven flagstones, the impact kicking up a fine mist of ancient mortar dust and echoing sharply down the corridor. Without the anchor of his blade, the massive warrior shifted his weight and lowered his towering frame. He bent his legs, sinking directly into the filth of the dungeon floor. His knees hit the wet, rotting dirt and jagged debris with a dull thud. He completely ignored the grime ruining the fine, dark wool of his tailored trousers, allowing the dampness of the subterranean vault to soak into the expensive fabric without a single downward glance. The Alpha King deliberately fell to his knees in the dust. He kept his posture wide and open. He lifted his hands slightly, turning his palms toward her in the dim light. His fingers, scarred from years of border wars and structural enforcement, were spread wide and entirely empty. It was a calculated, slow-motion demonstration of absolute harmlessness. Cora stared at his empty, calloused palms. Kings did not kneel. Feudal rulers, who commanded the vast northern territories, did not discard their blades in forgotten cellars for a bleeding fugitive. Yet, the man remained perfectly still in the dust, breathing in a slow, measured rhythm, waiting for her racing pulse to register the absence of danger. At the sound of the infant's soft cry, the sovereign made his next calculated choice. Remaining firmly on his knees, he brought his empty hands up to his own collar. His thick fingers worked the heavy iron brooches, fastening his outer garment. With a soft, heavy rustle of fabric, he eased the fur-lined royal cloak from his broad shoulders. As the garment left his body, the distinct scent of ozone, frozen pine, and clean winter wind spilled into the stagnant air of the cell. Leaning forward just enough to bridge the distance, Darius draped the immense weight of the cloak gently over Cora's trembling shoulders. He did not pull her toward him. He did not attempt to inspect the child hidden in her arms. He merely provided the covering, offering not a cage, but an absolute, undeniable sanctuary. The immediate sensory shift was profound. The residual body heat trapped deep within the dense fur bled instantly through Cora's freezing, damp skin. It was a heavy, anchoring warmth that sank into her aching muscles. Darius then lowered his gaze to the ground. Using his large, battle-worn hands, he methodically tucked the trailing edges of the heavy wool around her sides. He smoothed the fabric over the jagged edges of the crate and folded the thickest part of the hem firmly under her bare, frozen feet. He worked with the precision of a man sealing a perimeter, ensuring no stray draft could penetrate the cocoon he had just constructed. Throughout the entire process, his knuckles brushed only against the rough wool and the cold stone. He meticulously avoided touching her skin, maintaining a strict physical boundary that demanded nothing in return. The scent of ozone and cedar enveloped the mother completely, overpowering the metallic smell of blood and the suffocating odor of wet rot. Beneath the heavy drape of the cloak, the silver pup stopped shivering, his soft whimpering fading as the deep thermal warmth surrounded him. The king did not speak. He stayed anchored on his knees in the dirt, his hands resting lightly on his thighs, holding the space steady. He let the undeniable reality of the warmth, the heavy fabric, and the discarded broadsword do the work of proving his intentions. After a long minute, when the violent tremors racking her frame began to subside, Darius moved. With agonizingly slow precision, he slid one massive arm beneath her trembling knees and the other behind her spine. He gave her a full heartbeat to pull away, when Cora Sterling only curled tighter around the squirming weight of her baby, pressing her face into the collar of his cloak. The sovereign king stood. The ascent out of the forgotten vaults was a journey through shifting atmospheric layers. Cora's head rested against the solid wall of his chest. She listened to the steady, rhythmic thud of his heart, a sound so entirely devoid of aggression that it confused her fragmented mind. She had spent 9 months running from Alphas, whose heartbeats spiked with the erratic thrill of the hunt. Darius's pulse was the unhurried metronome of a sovereign who had nothing to prove. Her blood-stained knuckles were white where she gripped the dark fabric of his collar. Every survival instinct she possessed dictated that she should be scanning the shadows for an exit, preparing to claw her way out of his hold the moment his grip faltered. Yet, as he carried her up the spiraling stone staircase, a strange realization settled into her aching bones. She did not feel the urge to fight. She had been grabbed and restrained by men who believed her vulnerability was an invitation to cruelty. But he did not hold her like a possession. The king carried her like a fragile, invaluable archive, salvaged from a fire. The scent of ozone and frozen pine, radiating from his skin, felt less like a cage and more like a fortress wall. The environmental shift was profound. The metallic stench of blood and mildew from the lower cells gradually faded, replaced by the warm fragrance of melting beeswax and oiled cedar. The temperature changed from a hostile, damp chill to a dry, comforting heat that seeped directly into her battered joints. The king pushed open a set of reinforced oak doors, carrying her into the royal nursery wing. The space was flooded with the pale light of early morning, anchored by a massive stone hearth where thick logs of ash wood burned steadily. He crossed the woven rugs, his boots making no sound, and lowered her onto a wide bed, draped in pristine, sun-dried sheets. The moment her weight settled, he withdrew his hands. He stepped back immediately, retreating to the far side of the room to give her the geometry of the space, refusing to crowd her fragile sanctuary. A soft, rhythmic knock broke the heavy silence. Darius gave a low hum of permission. The heavy door clicked open, and Martha Glynn stepped across the threshold. The royal healer was a pragmatic, sturdy figure in a heavy woolen dress, her fingers permanently stained with the indigo ink of medical ledgers. She carried a wooden tray, steam rising from ceramic bowls. Cora instantly flinched, curling her body over the pup to form a defensive wall of bone and willpower. Strangers meant danger. Strangers meant discovery. But the older woman stopped immediately. She did not rush toward the bed or offer empty reassurances. Instead, she set the tray down on a distant side table with deliberate care. "I am going to stay right here for a moment," Martha said, her gravelly voice devoid of sudden movements. "My name is Martha. The king asked me to bring you warmth, and to see if you require any binding or salve." The young mother stared at her, chest heaving. The healer's hands remained perfectly visible, resting flat against her canvas apron. This was a language Cora understood, the careful, mathematical negotiation of physical space. "I am going to walk to the hearth now," Martha announced calmly. "I need to pour you a cup of tea." Only after she spoke did the healer move, pouring the steaming liquid. The rich, earthy scent of comfrey and roasted oats filled the room. "I am approaching the bed," she said, stopping 2 full paces away. "I am setting the tea on the nightstand. I will not touch you." Trembling hands emerged from the folds of the cloak. Cora reached for the mug, the heat of the ceramic seeping into her frozen palms. She took a small testing sip. It was sweet, thick, and perfectly warm. "If you permit it, I would like to examine," The child, just his breathing and temperature. I will not take him from your arms." Cora looked across the room at Darius, who remained entirely still by the window. He was letting her choose. Slowly, the Omega parted the heavy wool of the cloak, revealing the sleeping form of Ren Sterling. The morning sunlight caught the showering silver pelt, illuminating the metallic, impossible sheen of his fur. Martha's breath caught in her throat. Her ink-stained fingers twitched as she recognized the ancient lineage, but she instantly recovered her professional distance. "He is a beautiful, strong pup," the healer stated in a reverent, factual whisper. "I am going to touch his chest now, just with 2 fingers." She waited for a stiff nod before checking the newborn's heart rate. "Clear and steady," she confirmed, withdrawing her hand. Martha then pointed to the tray. "There is clean linen and warm water. I have a jar of yarrow and beeswax salve for the tearing. It will sting, then numb. You apply it yourself. I do not need to assist unless you ask." The replacement of brutal survival with documented care caused a pressure to build behind Cora's eyes. As she pressed her cheek against the clean linen, the suffocating armor of her terror finally began to crack. The fire in the royal chambers burned too bright. For months, Cora had calibrated her survival to the freezing damp of unlit cellars and the suffocating darkness of forgotten border camps. Now, sitting in a heavy velvet armchair before a massive stone hearth, the intense radiating heat felt less like comfort and more like an exposure. Every sudden pop of the burning pine logs made her shoulders jerk, her breath catching sharply in her throat. Her spine remained rigid against the plush upholstery. She held Ren against her chest, keeping her breathing even as she adjusted the torn shift linen still wrapped around her son, though the baby was now mostly swaddled in soft wool. The infant nursed quietly, his tiny fingers curling against her collarbone, blissfully unaware of the profound danger his mere existence represented. She did not look at the fire. Instead, Cora's eyes continuously tracked the geometry of the expansive room. Her mind, deeply scarred by Kai Helen's hunting parties, mapped the exits with clinical precision. There was the heavy oak door leading to the main corridor, currently sealed shut. There was the arched set of stained glass windows overlooking the inner courtyard, too high for a safe drop, but wide enough to break through if cornered. A secondary servant's passage sat disguised behind a heavy tapestry. She angled her body deliberately, turning her back to the solid stone wall and positioning her shoulders squarely between the door and the infant. If someone broke through the timber, they would have to cut through her spine before they ever saw the shimmering silver fur hidden beneath her bodice. The warmth of the hearth seeped into her aching joints, trying to thaw the deep frost of the dungeon, but her muscles refused to untighten. Trust was not a switch that could be flipped by the sudden presence of a fire or a fresh set of clothes. It was a currency she had entirely run out of. She monitored the rhythm of her own breathing, keeping it shallow and silent, listening beneath the crackle of the flames for the heavy tread of armored boots. The absolute quiet of the royal wing was unnerving. In the border pack, silence only ever meant an ambush was already in motion. She pressed her chin lightly against Ren's downy head, feeling the steady beat of his tiny heart against her ribs. That small pulse was the only anchor she had left. Everything else felt like an elaborate trap waiting to spring. She tightened her grip, her knuckles turning white against the pristine fabric. The heavy iron latch of the main door clicked. Cora stopped breathing entirely. Her free hand instantly clamped over the fabric shielding Ren, her body curling inward to make a smaller, harder target. The heavy oak swung open, but there was no rush of armed guards, no barked orders from hostile Betas demanding her surrender. Instead, the door moved with a slow, deliberate and measured pace. Darius stepped over the threshold. He did not wear the heavy broadsword he had discarded in the cellar, nor the imposing armor of a ruling monarch. He wore simple dark woolen trousers and a loose linen shirt, his immense frame filling the doorway. More jarring than his casual, unarmed attire was what he carried. Balanced carefully in his scarred palms, the Alpha King held a silver tray bearing a steaming ceramic bowl and a thick slice of dark bread. No servants flanked him in the corridor. No attendants announced his arrival. He had come completely alone. He paused just inside the chamber, his sharp gaze immediately finding Cora huddled in the corner by the fire. He saw the tight, defensive coil of her posture, the way her eyes darted toward the hidden servant's passage, and the rigid barrier of her arms wrapped around the child. Darius did not step closer. He did not offer a reassuring smile, nor did he attempt to close the distance with unearned familiarity. Instead, he moved sideways, his boots completely silent on the thick woven rugs. There was a small, polished wooden table set against the stone wall near the entrance, roughly 20 feet away from the hearth where Cora sat. Slowly, telegraphing every single movement so she could track his intentions, Darius lowered the tray onto the polished surface. The faint clink of porcelain against silver was the only sound echoing in the vast room. He stepped back immediately, leaving the food entirely within her line of sight, but far out of his own physical reach. "The broth is venison," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble that did not carry beyond the thick walls of the chamber. Martha insisted on adding bone marrow and roasted root vegetables. "It will help replenish your strength after the cold." He did not walk toward her to hand her the bowl. He did not ask to see the pup, nor did he demand any explanation for her presence in his territory. Darius turned and walked to the farthest corner of the room, selecting a straight-backed wooden chair near the frost-covered windows. He sat down heavily, crossing his arms over his chest, and looked out into the dark courtyard. He deliberately offered her the length of the entire room, placing himself as a physical barrier between her and the only door, while remaining entirely outside her defensive perimeter. Cora stared at him, her mind struggling to process the spatial geometry of the situation. The most powerful man in the Northern Territories had just delivered her a meal with his own hands, only to retreat to the shadows like a quiet sentry. He was not demanding gratitude. He was not commanding obedience or utilizing his rank to force intimacy. He was simply holding the space, providing necessary sustenance, and waiting. For the first time since she had fled into the winter storms, a tiny fracture appeared in the ice surrounding Cora's chest. She did not relax her grip on her son, but in the quiet safety of the room, she finally allowed herself to exhale. The thin layer of fat had congealed on the surface of the broth by the time Darius shifted his weight. Rising from his chair, the Alpha King retrieved a thick, leather-bound volume from a stack of archives he had carried in with the tray. It was not a weapon, nor a decree of possession. It was a ledger. The binding was worn, the corners softened by decades of handling, and it carried the distinct dry scent of the royal archives, a mix of old dust, beeswax, and fading parchment. He set it on the low wooden table between them and pushed it forward with the tip of his scarred index finger. He left it there, allowing her the choice to reach for it or ignore it. Stillness was her preferred armor, thinner than steel, but far lighter to carry. She extended one hesitant hand toward the book. The leather was cool to the touch. When she opened the heavy cover, the crackle of the vellum sounded unnecessarily loud over the popping embers of the fire. The pages were filled with meticulous, cramped handwriting. They were the regional pack registries, the official census documents from the northern borders stretching back for 3 generations. At first, she saw only columns of names, birth dates, and lineage markers. Then her eyes snagged on the harsh, jagged lines of red ink. They were not random cancellations. Every name struck through in that rusted, dried crimson belonged to a specific bloodline. She traced the cold parchment with her fingertips, feeling the slight indentation where the quill had pressed too hard into the paper. It was as if the clerk had dug the nib in with a vicious, careless finality. There was her great-uncle's name, marked deceased on the exact day of a supposed hunting accident. There was her cousin's name, Elara, followed by a notation of stillbirth that the young mother knew to be a lie, having seen the healthy pup with her own eyes before the border guards arrived. The systematic purging of any pup born with the showering silver pelt had been carefully documented, hidden as administrative adjustments, disease, and tragic winter losses. She stared at the red ink, bleeding into the porous vellum like a wound that refused to close. The sheer bureaucratic neatness of the genocide made the breath stall in her lungs. For years she had believed her terror was an isolated curse, a paranoia she had to carry alone. Seeing it here, quantified and archived by the sovereign court itself, shifted the weight in her chest. The pain did not vanish, but the crushing burden of being the only witness finally fractured. Darius Vaughan occupied silence the way other men occupied speech. Without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it, he did not tell her how to feel. He simply provided the documentary proof that her grief was real, her fear was justified, and her survival was a calculation that defied a deeply rooted conspiracy. The quiet of the nursery shifted. Heat from the hearth pressed into the room, thawing the dread settled deep in Cora's bones. The scent of ozone and frozen pine from the heavy fur-lined royal cloak draped nearby mingled with the dry dust of the ledger. She looked up from the registries. The Alpha King remained seated in the high-backed chair, his broad shoulders relaxed, hands resting loosely on his knees. There was no predatory calculation in his posture, no possessive hovering. The hollow exhaustion of childbirth pulled at her muscles, demanding rest. Yet her mind, honed by years of surviving a rigid hierarchy, immediately began to calculate the cost. Power never moved without a price. A king did not unseal restricted census files and offer personal sanctuary out of simple charity. The showering silver pelt covering her son was a symbol of ancient authority, a political asset that could force unruly border factions into submission. She closed the ledger. The heavy thud of the cover sounded final in the quiet room, scattering a few specks of ancient dust into the firelight. She looked at the sovereign, her jaw tightening as she prepared herself for the inevitable contract, not because she was afraid of a bargain, but because she needed to know exactly what currency she was trading. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice raspy but steady. Darius did not blink. He did not lean forward to intimidate her, nor did he offer a charming, evasive smile. "I want the registry corrected," he answered, his tone low and even. "The law requires accurate records. Those who falsified these ledgers have committed treason against the crown." "That is what the king wants," she said, her fingers curling protectively around her sleeping son. "What do you want from me, my son's lineage?" A political display to bring the outer territories to heel. The monarch let the question hang in the air, allowing space for her suspicion. Trust could not be commanded. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped a fraction. "I want the people who hunted you to stand before the tribunal and face the ink they spilled," Darius said, his large, scarred hands remaining perfectly still on his knees. "I want the laws of this territory to mean something more than a shield for murderers." He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to the small bundle in her arms before returning to her exhausted face. "And as for you, I want you to sleep without keeping one eye on the door." The words were pressed into her memory like a seal into hot wax. She waited for the trap, for the hidden claws, but there was only the steady, unhurried rhythm of his breathing. He was not asking for her submission. He was not demanding access to the infant's luminous coat to bolster his own reign. He was offering a structural dismantling of the machinery that had terrorized her, asking for nothing in return but her physical recovery. Cora looked down at the heavy ledger. She did not fall into his arms. She did not offer a sudden, sweeping devotion. Instead, she leaned her head back against the heavy upholstery of her chair, adjusted the weight of the sleeping pup against her chest, and let her shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. The fire popped, throwing a shower of orange sparks against the iron grate. In the quiet sanctuary of the royal nursery, The exhausting mechanics of survival finally began to slow. While the nursery remained quiet, the northern wind battered the outer walls. The heavy iron portcullis of Ashfell Keep remained lowered, casting jagged shadows across the snow-packed courtyard. Beyond the thick steel grates, the wind howled, carrying the bitter scent of frost and oiled leather. Caelan Vance sat atop his dark gelding, his posture impeccably straight. He did not shout for entry. Caelan preferred the suffocating violence of bureaucracy, weaponizing statutes long before baring his teeth. His breath plumed into the cold air like smoke. I formally request the extradition of a fugitive from my jurisdiction, an escaped Omega, traveling with a defective pup. They are undocumented and subject to the internal sanitary laws of the borderlands. He did not use her name. To Caelan, she was a discrepancy in his ledgers, an error requiring erasure. He rolled the parchment back up, tapping it lightly against his sword pommel. He offered the captain of the gate a polite, empty smile. "It is a simple administrative matter," Caelan added, his tone smooth and measured. "The pup carries an unfortunate mutation. It is a mercy to the pack that such anomalies are handled quietly. I only ask to retrieve my runaway property, sparing the sovereign king the burden of our internal affairs." The guards did not move. The wind continued to whip across the stone walls, but no one rushed to turn the gate winches. Caelan sat waiting, expecting the iron portcullis to groan open in deference to the treaty. He believed his interpretation of the law was an unbreakable shield, one the highest authority would not contest over a lowly woman. The massive wooden door built into the base of the gatehouse swung outward without a creak. The courtyard fell into a stillness so profound that the crunch of boots on the snow echoed against the stone. Darius stepped past the threshold. He wore no armor. Dressed in a dark tunic and a heavy wool mantle, the Alpha King walked with unhurried precision. The ambient temperature seemed to plummet. Caelan's horse sidestepped nervously, hooves striking the ice. The border leader tightened his grip on the reins, fighting the biological urge to lower his chin. He forced his smile to remain fixed, holding out the rolled vellum as Darius stopped 10 paces away, separated only by the iron bars. "Your Grace," Caelan said, inclining his head, "I apologize for the intrusion. I merely bring a legal petition for extradition, as an unfortunate oversight from my territory has crossed your borders." Darius did not look at the parchment. His unreadable gaze rested entirely on Caelan's face. When the king spoke, his voice was a low, measured whisper, pitched barely above the falling snow, yet it carried with absolute clarity, slipping through the iron grates. "There is no one here matching that description," Darius stated. The simplicity of the denial caught Caelan off guard. He blinked, his smile slipping as he tried to reassert his bureaucratic leverage. "My trackers followed the scent to the edge of the palace road. The law dictates that a host territory must permit a basic inspection of the outer wards to clear a fugitive warrant. It is a matter of transparency." "Are you citing a border accord to me in my own courtyard?" Darius asked, his voice dropping another fraction of a decibel. Caelan swallowed hard, the sharp movement visible above his fur collar. The parchment shield he relied on suddenly felt thin as wet paper. "I am requesting my right to search for a defective pup and the woman harboring it. The treaty explicitly allows the retrieval of such individuals. You will not search the keeps. You will not search the cellars. You will not step 1 foot past this iron gate." Darius interrupted, the quiet rhythm of his words striking with the force of a physical blow. He slowly clasped his hands behind his back, his relaxed posture amplifying the lethal pressure radiating from his still form. Caelan's knuckles whitened against his leather reins. The humiliation of being dismissed burned in his chest, but the brutal weight of the sovereign aura forced him to remain seated. "With respect, Your Grace, if you are sheltering them, you are harboring stolen assets. I have the legal right to cross this threshold." "Cross it," Darius whispered. The 2 words hung in the freezing air, utterly devoid of anger, entirely composed of chilling certainty. Take one step past the gatehouse, Kaelin. If you claim jurisdiction on sovereign soil, I will not treat it as a diplomatic dispute. I will treat it as an act of war, and I will dismantle your entire pack before the sun sets. Silence swallowed the courtyard. Kaelin's horse huffed a plume of white steam, pulling nervously at the bit. The border leader stared down at the sovereign. There was no negotiation to be had. The parchment in his hand meant absolutely nothing against a king who was the law itself. The heavy oak doors of the high council chamber did not creak when they were pushed open. They moved on well-oiled iron hinges, yielding a vast space defined by high vaulted ceilings, grey stone columns, and the sharp, dry scent of burning beeswax candles mixed with ancient parchment. Inside, the highest authorities of the Northern Reconstruction era sat around a massive circular table draped in dark green velvet. The air was thick with the rustle of turning pages and the low, murmuring debate over succession laws and territorial boundaries. At the head of the table sat Alpha King Darius Vaughan. He did not speak. He merely watched the doors, his posture a study in absolute terrifying patience. Cora Sterling stood at the threshold. A week ago, she would have pressed her spine against the freezing masonry of a dungeon vault, willing herself to become invisible, counting her shallow breaths to avoid detection. Now she felt the smooth, rich linen of her tailored gown brush against her ankles, the fabric holding the residual warmth of the private hearth she had just left. She did not lower her gaze. She did not shrink. Stepping over the polished brass threshold, she carried Wren Sterling in her arms, not swaddled in secrecy, but cradled openly against her chest. The murmurs in the vast chamber died away. The silence that fell over the elders was sudden and absolute, heavy enough to alter the atmospheric pressure of the room. Not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole. Cora walked down the center aisle, her soft leather shoes making no sound against the flagstones. Every eye tracked her movement, but she focused only on the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of her own breath. She reached the center of the council floor, stopping directly beneath the grand stained glass skylight that funneled the bright, harsh winter sun downward. Without a word of pleading, without a single tremor of hesitation, Cora shifted her arms. She carefully pulled back the edge of the woven blanket, exposing her newborn son to the piercing light. The showering silver pelt caught the sun instantly. The pup's fur did not just gleam. It seemed to refract the light, throwing off a brilliant metallic luminescence that had not been seen in the royal court for centuries. It was the biological signature of the ancient kings, a genetic truth that no forged ledger or political alliance could rewrite. Several elders gasped, their hands gripping the edges of the velvet-draped table. An inkwell was knocked over, dark liquid bleeding across a map, but no one moved to wipe it up. Cora did not cower. She did not hunch her shoulders to shield the child from their calculating stares. Instead, she lifted Wren slightly higher, offering the physical proof of his existence to the very system that had once hunted his kind to extinction. She watched the shock settle into the deeply lined faces of the councilmen. She was no longer a discarded Omega hiding in the dark. She was the mother of the sovereign heir. At the far end of the council table, Kaelin Vance sat frozen. The ruthless border leader had been summoned under the pretense of a routine territorial dispute, completely unaware of the devastating legal trap Darius had prepared. As the brilliant light reflected off the showering silver pelt, the arrogant sneer that usually rested on Kaelin's lips dissolved into a mask of pale, hollow panic. His eyes darted toward the high-arched windows, then back to the infant, his mind frantically attempting to calculate a political exit that no longer existed. Darius finally broke the silence. His voice was not a roar, nor did it carry the aggressive dominance of a lesser alpha. It was a low, measured drawl that echoed off the cold marble walls with the finality of a closing tomb. He did not address Cora. His dark, unyielding gaze was fixed entirely on the border commander. With a slow, deliberate motion, the king slid a heavy stack of unsealed ledgers across the velvet table. The thick parchment pages documented decades of systemic atrocities. The quiet, illegal executions of pups born with non-standard traits under Kyelan's direct jurisdiction. The math was flawless. The medical records, cross-referenced with Martha Glynn's archival notes, provided a chronological map of genocide designed to eliminate any rival royal bloodline before it could threaten the border pack's autonomy. Kyelan opened his mouth to object, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests of his heavy wooden chair. He looked for an ally, a sympathetic face among the elders, but found only the cold, unyielding geometry of a court that had just seen undeniable proof of his treason. The witness circle had already reviewed the ink. The truth was structural, mathematical, and entirely inescapable. By the authority of the Blood Treaty of Ashfell, Darius stated, the quiet resonance of his words leaving no room for debate. Your command is permanently dissolved. Your rank is stripped. You are exiled to the frozen wastelands beyond the northern spine, effective immediately, with no provision for return. Kyelan's chest heaved. For a fraction of a second, the instinct to fight, to rely on the brute force of his remaining guards, flared in his eyes, but it died just as quickly under the crushing weight of the sovereign's gaze. One of the senior council elders stepped forward. Without a word, the old man reached out and unclasped the heavy iron insignia of Border Command from Kyelan's lapel. The pin snagged briefly on the fine wool of his coat before breaking free. The elder let the metal drop. It hit the stone floor with a sharp, echoing clatter. To Cora, standing tall and perfectly still in the center of the sunlight, the sound mirrored the exact metallic ring of Darius dropping his broadsword in the freezing dungeon vaults. The sound of a weapon surrendered, of a terror finally coming to an end. Kyelan stared blankly at the discarded emblem of his authority, stripped of everything, before the guards stepped forward to escort him out into the bitter cold. Later that afternoon, with the threat officially dismantled, the heavy oak doors of the archive chamber closed with a definitive echoing thud, sealing them inside the quietest room in Ashfell Keep. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of melted red beeswax, dry parchment, and the cold iron of the vaulted ceiling. Following the chaos of the High Council chamber, this absolute stillness felt like a physical weight pressing against Cora Sterling's skin. She stood before a massive, black iron table. Resting at its center was the Royal Registry, a ledger so ancient that its spine was bound in cracked, blackened leather. Darius Vaughan stood a few paces to her left, his broad shoulders relaxed, silently holding the space as she prepared to sign. The archive keeper with ink-stained knuckles stepped forward from the shadows, bowing his head respectfully before offering Cora a long, dark feather quill. She took it. The polished spine of the feather felt cool and solid against her fingertips. A week ago, her hands had been trembling in the freezing damp of a forgotten cellar, her fingers clumsy and numb as she wrapped him in torn shift linen to keep her child alive. A week ago, she was an erased woman, a discarded Omega, hunted for the rare bloodline she carried. She looked down at the thick vellum page. There, written in fresh, dark ink by the scribe, was the formal designation of her son. The word sovereign heir sat firmly next to Wren Sterling's name, permanently linking his showering silver pelt to the throne, rather than marking him for a death sentence. Cora dipped the quill into the iron inkwell. The scratching sound of her signature on the heavy parchment was the loudest sound in the silent room. It was a slow, deliberate friction. She did not rush. She formed every letter of her name with calculated precision, letting the dark ink bleed into the fiber of the page. She left no room for ambiguity. She did not sign as a dependent, nor as a temporary ward of the court. She signed as the mother of the future king, officially designating her son as the sovereign heir, securing their permanent safety through undeniable documentation. Ink dried faster than tears in the bitter northern wind, and this ink would outlast them all. When she lifted the quill, The silence stretched. Darius watched the ink settle, his breathing slow and measured. His silence was a kind of architecture, a fortress wall being built around her, brick by brick, entirely out of respect. The archive keeper stepped forward, lifting a heavy brass stamp. He pressed the royal seal into a pool of hot crimson wax beside her name. The wet, heavy sound of the stamp lifting away finalized it. The law was written. Calen Vance's arrogant cruelty, the years of systemic erasure, and the terror of the borderland hunts had all been dismantled by a single stroke of a pen. She set the quill down on the iron table, feeling the particular kind of peace that comes when a lifelong war is finally permanently won. The royal nursery smelled of dried lavender, warm milk, and burning cedar. The hearth fire cast a steady, deep orange glow across the polished stone floor, pushing back the bitter evening frost that pressed relentlessly against the tall glass windows. It was a space designed entirely for warmth, stripped of the sharp edges and drafty corridors that defined the rest of the ancient keep. Cora sat on the thick woven rug directly before the flames, her legs tucked beneath her. The rigid, calculated tension that had locked her spine into a permanent state of readiness for years was finally beginning to fracture. Beside her, Darius sat with equal stillness on the rug, discarding the formalities of his throne room to meet her at eye level. Between them lay the small, steady form of her son. Cora reached out, wrapping Ren in the fur-lined royal cloak that Darius had offered them in the dungeon. The brilliant, metallic tufts of the pup's showering silver pelt contrasted sharply with the dark, thick, bare fur of the mantle. The cloak carried the faint, grounding scent of ozone and frozen pine, a permanent reminder of the king's unyielding protection, now mingling with the sweet, innocent warmth of the sleeping newborn. Ren let out a soft, contented sigh, his tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Cora stared into the dying embers, waiting for the familiar anxiety to strike. She waited for her mind to automatically begin calculating the geometry of the room, mapping the fastest exit routes, or inventorying the scarce supplies she would need for a sudden midnight flight. But the calculations did not come. For the first time since she had fled the borderlands, the exhausting survival inventory in her head simply stopped. There were no coins to count, no footsteps to listen for, no cruel elders to evade. The realization settled in her chest like a stone dropping through still water, slow, thorough, filling every crack of her fractured foundation. She allowed herself a slow exhale, letting her physical guard drop completely. It was a millimeter of movement, a tiny, deliberate surrender of her armored posture, until she shifted her weight sideways. Cora leaned her shoulder against Darius's arm, her breathing slow and regular. The quiet, practical gesture of trust felt heavier than any spoken vow. Darius did not flinch. He did not shift his weight, nor did he wrap his arms around her to cage her against him or claim the victory of her touch. He understood the profound weight of her choice. Instead, he simply anchored himself, holding his body perfectly steady, offering his sheer physical strength as a solid, immovable wall against which she could safely rest. He occupied the space beside her without demanding anything in return, his presence a quiet promise that she would never have to carry the burden of her survival alone again. The winter wind outside howled against the fortress stone, a bitter, freezing threat that could no longer reach them. Inside, the fire burned bright, the legal ledgers were sealed, and the silence was finally permanently safe.